Part 4, page 48. I was charged up with a renewed desire to write. I hopped in my car and I blew out of Jacksonville and drove all day in the rain like a maniac towards the Keys. I stopped in Melbourne to get some gas and thought of Jim Morrison singing about how people are strange. I looked around the gas station and they sure were. I jumped back in the car and got going. Once I passed Miami, I began to see a steady stream of cars coming the other way, and I noticed no one but me was heading for Key West. I fiddled with the radio until I found a report that an early tropical storm was shifting north from Cuba and might hit the Keys with a hurricane-force winds by nightfall. I gunned my car and sped down the causeway, skipping from key to key until I arrived in Key West. It was already raining sideways and the palm trees were wagging their leaves at me. I laughed out loud. It was thrilling. The whole place was boarded shut and taped up, but nothing could stop me from being there in the middle of it. I was still pumped up on Henry Fleming's courage. He was waving a flag and I was carrying a pen. I found a motel made of cinder blocks and checked in. I got a good rate. Then I went down to the gas station store and I bought what candles, water, and food were left. When I returned to my room, I flicked the TV to the storm report and watched the almost a hurricane head away. It never developed into more than a gale with 80-mile-an-hour gusts. It passed over us at the night, dumping a foot of rain and blowing down the weak trees. The greatest damage was done to the tourist industry. The vacationers had fled. Of course, it didn't help that the TV stations played Key Largo on one channel and a documentary on the Great Hurricane of 1935 on the other. That hurricane had killed over 800 people who were fleeing by rescue train when a 12-foot surge of water, whipped up by 200-mile-an-hour winds, swamped the passenger cars and took them all away. When the bodies were finally collected, they were burned in tall pyres like Hindus on the Ganges. And when the rescuers ran out of driftwood, they buried the rest in a mass grave. In the morning, when I emerged from my room, the locals were out and about cleaning up the mess, and a few drunken tourists were still celebrating their victory over nature. But the rest had fled and left the place to me. Right away, I started making my rounds. First, I went to Ernest Hemingway's house. He had killed himself on my birthday, my 10th birthday. He took a shotgun, put the barrel in his mouth, and pulled the trigger with his toe. My dad had read The Old Man and the Sea to me because it was a fishing story. I'd have shot myself too, he said after reading the obituary in the paper, if it took me that long to catch a fish. That's sick. Hemingway's house had survived the storm, except the giant swimming pool was filled with brackish water and debris, along with a magnificent sea turtle that I immediately named Ernest. I imagined the big man as a wide across his back and tanned as the dark turtle and just as unflappable as it did, a slow breaststroke from end to end. I untangled an aluminum lawn chair which had blown into a manchineel tree. I sat down with my writing journal and grinned like an idiot. Just describing that huge brooding turtle lumbering from one end to the end was inspiring. I was so happy to be the first one on the scene and wrote down all of my impressions, just as Hemingway did in Spain during the Civil War and Crane after the sinking of the Commodore. Suddenly, I remembered that John Hershey lived in Key West. His on-the-scene reportage of Hiroshima after the atomic bomb was incredible. These guys had gone into the heart of something raw and humanly transforming and had survived to write the great books. They got their beginning as writers by going where the action was, to war, and I could too. With Vietnam on fire, the Army was taking everyone they could get. But there was no guarantee I could be a journalist like Hershey. Instead, I could end up more like George Orwell and take a bullet through the neck. And there was something else. As much as I despised the war, deep inside I felt like I was a coward. Like Henry Fleming, I figured when the bullets started chewing up the ground around me, I'd duck and run. I depressed myself. The only thing I had to write about was a turtle in Hemingway's pool. Moments before it seemed so romantic, and now it seemed mundane. In order to buck up, I went searching for John Hershey's house. Maybe seeing where he lived would give me another boost of courage. I got into my car and drove to a market. There were guidebooks to Key West, but none of them gave his address. He was mentioned after Tennessee Williams and Elizabeth Bishop, whose addresses were listed. I went to the Williams house. It looked fine, except for the little white gazebo he built for Jane Bowles had toppled over. I'd read A Streetcar Named Desire and The Glass Menagerie, and like everyone, I thought Williams was a genius. I hadn't read Jane Bowles' work, but I knew her husband's book, The Delicate Prey, which was just about my favorite collection of stories in the world. Paul Bowles had gone to Morocco to write about Moroccans. I was hoping that St. Croix might be interesting to write about. Maybe I could begin to write something important there. I drove down to Elizabeth Bishop's small house, and I hadn't read her poetry, and I wished I had. Someone once said that